How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
Roughly every 5 years, the U.S. designs and implements a new farm bill, which sets out federal policy on a huge swath of agricultural programs, including subsidies, food assistance, land practices, and more. As stakeholders begin to strategize around the 2023 Farm Bill, many are pushing to make climate adaptation and mitigation primary aspects of policy design. Today, we hear from Chuck Connor, President and CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, and Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at Environmental Working Group, digging deep into the next Farm Bill, today on Climate One. Chuck, you say that 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about climate with your member farmers. Now you can. What are your conversations like now?
Well, I think, Greg, many, and I would go as far as to say most in American agriculture today, when this issue came up in the 2009-2010 period, there was great fear among farmers. There was just a thought that climate debate and climate, if you will, friendly policies just simply meant somebody was going to be standing there looking over their farmers' shoulders, telling them how to farm, and you know, sort of a micromanaged kind of situation. And I think over time we have shown them that that is not the case, that this is about providing the right information to them. This is about providing, you know, efficiency options. This is about doing it, you know, the best that you possibly can, but all in a manner that gives them complete and total control over their land and their farming operations. And they're supportive of that. And they're growing stronger every day. And I think there's a sentiment out there that we can be pro-climate, we can be pro-farmer, pro-farm income. And we weren't there 10 years ago. And it's a much better environment.
Chuck, what's been your personal journey? Was it hard for you to accept climate science as a farmer yourself?
Well, Greg, on our family farm, we've been no-till farming. I think this is our 39th year on that particular farm. There hasn't been a piece of tillage equipment touch that land. And so, you know, we've seen for a very, very long time that there's value. You know, we were doing it, I guess, before climate change was even being discussed, but it just seemed like the right environmental policy. So this is not a new thing to us, and I'm thankful that we're going to have an opportunity for a debate here that involves farmers with their input, and again, something that we believe can be win-win, and many farmers today feel the same way.
Scott, the Environmental Working Group keeps a database of farm subsidies and crop insurance payments. What has your data shown on who gets those payments? Most of those dollars have gone to complex farming operations and households. Tell us where the money goes.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that we need a farm safety net. We need ways to help farmers weather the ups and downs of agriculture, especially now that extreme weather is impacting farmers' livelihoods. And I think also it's the case that most farmers agree that there ought to be reasonable limits on who receives those payments and how much they receive. You know, if you're very, very successful, you probably reach a point where you no longer need the government support. Unfortunately, we don't have meaningful limits on our subsidies. There have been efforts to place a real means test in place. Chuck led some of those efforts when he worked for the Department of Agriculture. And the result of those loopholes, if you will, is that some very, very large operators are getting millions of dollars every year. I don't think anyone probably, except perhaps the family members and friends of those operators, think that makes much sense. And I think there's probably consensus between environmental groups and taxpayer groups and farm groups that We need a safety net. It needs to really be a strong safety net, but we also need to have reasonable limits on who can get subsidies because they're so successful, and then the amounts that they get. That I can't imagine any situation where any individual should get millions and millions of dollars from the taxpayer. That just doesn't make much sense.
Chuck, if the Farm Bill is written with the notion that we produce too much and need to keep the brakes on, help me understand the role of subsidies. Are we paying farmers to not produce crops, livestock, or dairy, and why?
Well, this has been a paradigm of farm policy, Greg, since the 1930s, where we really began to make, some large crop subsidies during the Great Depression. And I think you could, make an argument in that during those early years of, paying at a time that you were trying to get less production, there could be some conflicts there. And for many years, we had to have government sponsored set-asides, just sort of keep that check and balance in work. We're not paying a tremendous amount in farm subsidies right now, Greg, and that's a mischaracterization by some out there. Compared to the farm bills that I worked on for the Senate Ag Committee in the 1980s, we're paying really a lot less in farm subsidies. So I don't see those subsidies having the market impact like they did, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Today, they're a pretty nominal part of the overall income picture for a farmer.
Scott, your colleague Ann Scheckinger found that between 2001 and 2020, farmers received 1.5 billion in crop insurance payments for planting crops in flood-prone parts of the Mississippi River Basin. Her analysis argued that money could have been spent to retire or restore lands for carbon sequestration benefit instead. Are we spending taxpayer money in the best way in the flood-prone areas of the Mississippi?
Yeah, well, and let me reiterate that we need a strong farm safety net. That includes helping farmers obtain crop insurance so they can manage their risks. But there are some important lessons to be learned from the flood insurance program that property owners participate in that ought to be applied to the crop insurance program, and especially where you have folks who are getting repeatedly flooded, who are farming very wet grounds, and because of their repeat indemnities from the crop insurance program are increasing the cost of crop insurance for everyone else. So there are probably some opportunities to adjust rates to send the right market signals to folks who are farming places that they might not otherwise farm without the government subsidized crop insurance subsidy. There are also some opportunities to probably make better use of the conservation reserve program, the land retirement program that's been around for many decades, so that we're better targeting those acres at those frequently flooded floodplain lands, partly to avoid those government payments, right? If those are lands that are hard to farm, they're frequently flooded, marginal lands. Let's use our CRP dollars, our land retirement dollars, to try to offer those farmers an easement, in part to, again, avoid the taxpayer cost, but also to get all the environmental benefits, especially the long-term storage of carbon in the soil and the wildlife benefits, the water quality benefits that would come from restoring some of those lands. And I think the other benefit of really focusing CRP on lands that are frequently flooded or hard to farm lands is you're directing CRP acres away from the prime farmland that farmers ought to be farming. And we shouldn't be wasting our precious CRP dollars, our land retirement dollars, on acres of prime farmland, only to see that land plowed up 10 years later. There's not much benefit there.
Chuck, your thoughts on reforming that? We all know that the National Flood Insurance Program is broken. Congress has tried and failed to fix it. How about climate resilience in terms of crop insurance?
Well, crop insurance is a complicated issue, Greg. I'm not discounting any of Scott's points, on their face. I think these are always things that we need to look at. There's been a number of attempts in the past to have rates reflect, that risk on that, in that particular region, in that floodplain, so that, a farmer in McLean County, Illinois, sort of the prime farmland of the United States, is not, paying the same insurance for his operation as someone who's farming in the Wabash River floodplain sort of thing. And I think we've achieved some of that. Would I stand up here and absolutely pound and say, we're there? No, I wouldn't do that at all, not even close. But I do appreciate Scott's comments on the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. We've collaborated together a lot on that program through the years, and it's had a lot of evolution. And I do hope that down the road, CRP continues to be a vehicle whereby we can farm, as you know, as is described, the most valuable land, and where land is highly sensitive, be able to use programs like the CRP to take that land out of production.
Chuck, your group is part of the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, which has expressed support for climate smart policies under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which are voluntary, incentive-based, and focused on commodity crops. Learning from other sectors where industry, of course, prefers voluntary measures first, and those only go so far. What do you expect from those policies can accomplish, voluntary, incentive-based?
I think they can fully accomplish our objectives here, Greg, and I don't in any way accept that this is a precursor to something mandatory coming down the pike. I believe we can achieve those objectives. We've done it in the past in agriculture. You know, we recollect back to the Dust Bowl years and all the problems we had with soil erosion. Through voluntary incentive-based programs, through technical assistance from soil specialists, we have curbed a great deal. I would say almost all of those kinds of conservation problems. When Scott and I probably first met and were working together, Swamp Buster, was a big issue. We were losing wetlands at an alarming rate in American agriculture. We've stemmed a lot of that loss again through these kind of voluntary programs. I see no reason to believe that we can't stem this problem with climate change and the problems that we have out there using this same model. Now it's going to require funding, and we're all going to need to work together. And this is the reason we formed the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, is to bring folks together so that we can all kind of pull in the same direction. But I think if we can continue that pulling in the same direction, these programs have the ability to solve the problem, not just be a beginning to something different later on.
Scott, the two biggest sectors of emissions in the U.S. are the utilities, electricity, buildings, and transportation mobility. Those industries have also said, well, we got this, voluntary, incremental, comfortable, we'll get there without government regulation. That didn't really prove the case. Is it the case in agriculture that voluntary, incremental will get us to our climate goals?
Well, there's no question that farmers can take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and many are already doing so. The real tragedy of our policy right now is that 2 out of 3 farmers who go to USDA and ask to, with their own money, bringing their own money to the table, and ask the government to help share the cost of practices to use their nitrogen fertilizer differently, or change how they're using nitrogen fertilizer, or change how they're feeding their animals, or how they're storing animal waste. 2 out of 3 farmers who ask for government assistance are being turned away because of our misplaced spending priorities. So just to make that even clearer, just imagine this. So a farmer is going to the government saying, I want to help be part of the climate solution. I want to change the way I farm to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're saying no. We're saying we're not going to help you. That is ridiculous. And I think every American from across the political spectrum would agree that it should be a big priority for the government to share the costs of those practices. They're not free. They're not free to the farmer, and they work. We know they work. We could always learn more. We're going to learn more soon because of some things that Secretary Vilsack and his team have put in place. But we know there are steps that farmers can do to reduce emissions, especially of nitrous oxide, which is caused by using commercial fertilizers, and methane emissions, which come from animals and their waste. And I think to their credit, Chuck's organization joined with groups like EWG to support a big increase in the spending for these climate smart practices in the Build Back Better bill that has passed the House and is still pending in the Senate. But we need to make better use of the $6 billion a year we already are giving farmers. We have right now that USDA is giving farmers. Too little of that money, which flows primarily through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and the Conservation Reserve Program, too little of that money is going to practices that reduce emissions, and too much of it is going to practices that either don't do much to reduce emissions or in some cases even increase emissions. So we need to, I think, if while Secretary Vilsack and his team has done a lot to make climate smart practices a priority, and we need more money, as has been proposed in Build Back Better, we need to make much better use of the money that Congress has already provided in the last Farm Bill.
Chuck, some of the biggest optimists I talk to across the climate spectrum are people who are interested in soil regeneration. Soil can capture water, carbon, all sorts of things. It's tough to scale, but that's pretty upsetting to hear Scott say that farmers are going asking for climate smart help and they're not getting it from the federal government. What's broken? What's wrong?
Well, Greg, we've got too few resources. I think Scott laid out the problem, and what he just answered, I wholeheartedly agree with it. I would like to see us, not only rework some of our existing programs in the Farm Bill to really give them a climate focus, but obviously we also, part of the reason so many people are being turned away is just, not enough resources here, and I think. What we call the Title II of the Farm Bill, which is all the conservation title, I think it's a title that needs additional resources. It needs additional resources targeted at programs that have a real strong climate underpinnings associated with them. And again, if we can achieve this, Greg, this is not just a Band-Aid or window dressing. These are real solutions to real climate problems. And I again think it's one that farmers like, they understand their local NRCS offices. These are people who know their farms. They don't make farmers feel like, that someone is coming in and telling them, how to run their farming operations. So again, just back to that win-win notion, Title II of the Farm Bill can be win-win, but we are going to need better use of resources and probably more resources when you get right down to the bottom line.
Well, let's talk about the political and economic context for that. We've seen some really big legislation. Really, $1 trillion used to be a lot of money in Washington. Now we've seen several $1 trillion bills go through for COVID. What's the political and economic landscape right now for a more ambitious farm bill? What do you see in there, Scott?
Well, Congress still has plenty of time to pass a Build Back Better package or some version of it that includes the $27 billion that the House approved and that Senator Stabenow has so effectively championed in the Senate for these climate smart practices. So that would be an enormous missed opportunity if we left $27 billion in funding to help farmers reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the table. What a waste that would be. And I think there's not just a really powerful, environmental case, right? We know that spending $27 billion on better use of fertilizer, better use of changing what we feed animals, changing how we manage manure, we know those things will reduce nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions. There's also a really strong business case for making these investments, and that's because right now, U.S. agriculture accounts for at least 10% of US emissions. But every other sector, mostly because of policies we've adopted like renewable portfolio standards and CAFE standards, every other sector of the economy is taking steps to reduce their emissions, except for, unfortunately, our farmers. The emissions, when you look at the EPA's greenhouse gas inventory over time, those emissions are going up, and that's no fault of the farmer. It's simply because we are eating more and more meat. We are producing more and more meat for a growing population around the globe. And when you fertilize animal feed and when you raise animals, you're going to increase nitrous oxide and methane emissions. So while US farmers may only account for 10% or maybe 15% of US emissions now, as other sectors reduce their emissions and agriculture's emissions inevitably go up because meat consumption goes up, US farmers' share of emissions is going to go up as well. It could easily be 20% by the end of this decade and 30% by the end of the next decade. And so I think there's not just a really obvious environmental case for helping to share the cost of these practices. I think there's a real reputational risk to our farmers if we don't help every way we can and use every tool in the toolbox to reduce emissions soon, because it's at some level it's just a math problem, right? If we double animal protein demand globally, as many think we will by 2050, and we don't pretty significantly change the way we fertilize, feed, and what we feed animals and how we manage their manure, then it's just inevitable that those emissions are going to keep going up.
Chuck, the aviation industry had a similar problem. As autos and building emissions are going down, aviation was going up. They realized they had a target on their back. They needed to do something because they were going to be going the wrong direction on something really important. Your response there on reducing agricultural, bending the curve on ag, and a lot of the U.S. Subsidies go for commodity crops, corn, soy, wheat. Much of that doesn't go directly to feed humans. It goes to feed livestock. How can that be addressed?
Well, I think it's hard to draw a comparison between autos and airplanes and the food that we eat, Greg, just to be perfectly honest. For those industries, you can talk about, well, maybe we need, to not buy that new car. Maybe, we need to encourage people to fly less, or those kinds of issues, and you can have good and honest debates. We can't have a good and honest debate here about scaling back food production in the United States of America. That people who suggest something like that are I get wide-eyed with, how can you possibly think, particularly during the times that we're in now. That was a hard one to justify a year ago. In today's environment, where even here in the good old United States, people are worried and having trouble identifying the foods that they need. I don't know that the numbers are exactly right that Scott has quoted here, but there is no question that the United States of America has got to increase our level of food production dramatically in the next several decades, or else the consequences for this planet are in pretty rough shape. Now, again, the good news is I think we can have it all here. I think we can have that increased production that we're going to need, that the world is going to need. I think that can be in animals. I think it can be in other crops, and be that plethora of options that, we have grown so accustomed to here in the U.S. And I'm not one who believes necessarily in a lot of good food, bad food kind of lingo at this point. But I think we can have, those kinds of options available to us, but do so in a responsible, climate friendly manner. And we've talked about how we do that, but in food, it's essential that we do that, because the option of just simply saying, well, no, you can't have it. You can't do that in food, for crying out loud. So we've got to produce it. We've got to, work with them to do it in the best way we possibly can.
I think the criticism would come from, if I could, Chuck, just the criticism would come from industrial monoculture. Feeding, corn, soy to animals is a real inefficient way to take energy from the sun to crops to animals to people. We know that we need to produce more food for a growing global population. I think the question is whether industrial monocropping, which has a lot of impacts, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of externalities, things that are created for that sort of calorie per acre efficiency. So there are people who say, look, organic, more regenerative agriculture, the industrial establishment is not the only way to do it.
Well, again, Greg, I sort of bristle at your characterization of industrial establishment. Food in America is produced on family farms, like my family's own farm. It takes a lot of different shapes and sizes, but these are generational farms, that have been handed down through, passed from one generation to the next. The producers themselves are the ones, they're on the farm, getting their hands dirty, doing this kind of work. So it's not sort of some kind of corporate industrial sort of complex. It's family farmers out there. And that's the reason we have the farm policy we have in this country. Scott and I can, have a good debate on what the right size ought to be. And that's open for some debate, but at the end of the day, they're family farmers. And that's why we try and help them, is to keep these farms in the family, rather than in Wall Street in some capacity, or in some Chinese investment firm or something of that sort. So it's a great system, and we're going to need a lot more of it. And it's not to say it's a perfect system. We've got, you've identified problems that exist out there. There's been a lot of effort to try and solve, some of those problems. There's going to be more effort, needs to be more effort going forward in solving, some of those problems that are created, through improper, use of fertilizers at times. And boy, the industry, part of the industry I represent, they've made incredible headroads just in the last 5 years of applying technology to make sure, that these products do what they say they're going to do and nothing more and nothing less. And that precision agriculture is so strong out there today. My cooperative members who supply a lot of these products, the demand that they have from their farmer members today is more information about how to do it right, as much as it is about, getting them the products they need. They want the information, and there's more and more great information out there, great ability to do these things better. And we've got to pursue every one of them.
I'll just add, I think it was President Obama who said, we need big farms and small farms. We need organic farms and conventional farms. We need to make it easier for farmers to choose the practices and tools that Chuck talked about that help reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer, that help change what we feed animals, whether that's what's in the feed mix or adding feed additives to the feed mix. We need to change the ways we manage animal waste to reduce emissions. And we need to do more we need to make that easier for folks. And again, if we double animal protein production and consumption, there's no way we're going to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves for the climate. We've got to make it easier for consumers to occasionally try and replace an animal protein with a plant-based protein to get a little bit more of our protein from plants. That's a great opportunity for our farmers. We need to make some bets in the next Farm Bill. We need to help scale up these companies that are making plant-based proteins. We need to look at subsidy programs for some of these pulse crops, and to make sure that there's an incentive for our farmers to grow these ingredients, so they're not being grown, as many of them are now, in Canada or other places.
On Climate One today, we've been digging deep into the next Farm Bill with Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Environmental Working Group, and Chuck Connor, President and CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. This episode has been generously supported by our friends at Bank of the West. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. We'll see you next time, everybody.